Welcome back. I'm taping today from New Delhi, India, the great Mughal capital of India, and you're going to hear some noises quite probably from outside. So that's the real India that I'm giving you. Today we're going to talk about a criticism I got from a listener called, let's just call her Ann B. And she was pointing out that in episode number 5, I gave one side, which was Roland Fryer's side, but I didn't give a rebuttal to Roland Fryer. So her criticism was there's always two sides to a debate, so why didn't you give the other side? So let me summarize what happened in episode 5, and then I'll go into her concerns. So in episode 5, we had the story of a teacher in Toronto called Angelo, who saw young black men being killed by cops when the young black men were not armed. Therefore, he concluded that there's racial bias in policing. And that's a statement that you often hear. And I presented the research of Roland Fryer, who's a professor at Harvard, an economist. What Roland Fryer did was take traffic stops throughout the US and evaluate them for racial bias. And he found that there was no statistically significant racial bias in police stops. Now, let me start before I rebut it by pointing something out to Ann B, and that is there's this common misconception there's always two sides to an argument. That's not correct. I mentioned that there's 3 types of reasoning: deterministic reasoning, stochastic reasoning, and value judgments in a previous video. Well, deterministic reasoning has no debate possible. They're facts. So for example, Newtonian law as being a specific case of Einstein's law is something that can be replicated and therefore is factual. There's no debate about Newtonian law. Stochastic and value judgments can be debated. So for example, when I was in university, I was a British debating champion along with my partner, and we went to the World Debating Championships in Dublin, Ireland, and we ended up in the final round, and the topic was Western civilization is in decline. Well, that's debatable because there is no correct answer. There's just an argument. Same thing applies to stochastic arguments, where you have correlation and probability. But the difference is they're not as interesting to argue because it boils down to rather dry arguments about the way statistics are created. And you have to kind of know something about statistics to make a rebuttal of statistics. And that's usually very boring. We often hear the phrase, there's lies, damn lies in statistics. And that's a quote from Mark Twain. And we often hear that refrain reflected back at us by people who basically can't count or never took a statistics class or failed their statistics class, right? And it's a way to avoid using statistics in an argument. But that's not correct. It's correct in that statistics can be misused, but it doesn't mean they have no value. They have tremendous value, from gambling all the way to different models like climate models. Having said that, a rebuttal against an argument like Roland Fryer is really a stochastic argument rebuttal. And so that's what I'm going to give you now. Essentially, the rebuttal is to say that in a correct statistical inference, you need both a random sample and a large sample size. And the essential argument is that Roland Fryer did not have a random sample in his data points. Why is that? It's because police officers in the US have a quota. They have to make a certain number of stops and a certain number of arrests. So if you and I were a cop in the US, we would go to poor areas because that's where crime happens. And poor areas tend to be disproportionately skewed towards certain ethnic groups for a variety of reasons. So if I have traffic stops, I'll have more traffic stops in poor areas. Therefore, all traffic stops will be skewed towards poor areas. Therefore, inferences drawn from traffic stops are not inferences drawn from a random sample, but a skewed sample. Therefore, the issue of whether there's police bias racially in traffic stops cannot really be determined through looking at traffic stops alone. Now, understand that Roland Fryer did what economists do. They took the best data they had, they created a model, and they created a statistical inference. The only problem is that it's the best we have. It's not as good as other data we don't have. The ultimate data would be if you could plant a chip in someone's brain and you could assess whether they actually have a racial bias when they're making a traffic stop. Then you would be able to come up with a criteria other than traffic stops, just every police interaction with an individual, and you'd be able to tell the real answer to whether there's a racial bias. But we don't have that data. All we have is surrogate data that is a proxy for the real world. But if that proxy is biased, and in this case, if the proxy is skewed, then it's a bad proxy. And that's essentially the argument against Roland Fryer. Now, Roland Fryer, being an economist, and being a prominent economist, and being of the Chicago School of Economics, would love to hear this rebuttal, because he's trying to improve his thinking, he's trying to improve his assumptions, he's trying to improve the quality of his conclusions, and he can only do that with rebuttals. So if you take a look, which I encourage you to do, at a seminar he gave on this very topic at University of Austin, which is a new university to cultivate liberal arts skills. You can see it on YouTube. You see him going through the arguments, and you see him asking his students for a rebuttal, for questioning of his assumptions. But if Angelo would have made that argument, I would have had more respect for him, because instead of literally losing his temper, I expected that kind of calm reasoning. Because in stochastic reasoning and in value judgments, there always are two sides. And he could have calmed down and just given that other side, which in this case is a bit dry, but nevertheless it's a valid rebuttal to Roland Fryer. So with that, I'll rest today, and I'll see you in the next video.